All right, so go ahead and get it started for this evening. So, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Uh, TADL Not Just Books is our YouTube channel, and we will be putting this on there. So, if you're unable to join us this evening and would like to continue to watch, you'll be able to find us there. So, tonight I have the pleasure of being joined by Robert Swartwood. He is the USA Today's best-selling author of The Serial Killer's Wife, The Calling Man, The Calling, Man of Wax, and several other novels. His work has appeared on the Los Angeles Review, The Daily Beast, Zine, Space and Time, Postscripts, and Pank. He created the term hint fiction and is the editor of Hint Fiction, an anthology of stories in 25 words or fewer. He lives with his wife in Pennsylvania and is joining us this evening. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
So, do you want to go ahead and I know you just came out with a brand new book. Let's see, The Killing Room. And I was reading a little bit
Yes.
about it, and it starts off in Las Vegas in a hotel room with a
Yes.
dead person in the bathtub. I was like, ooh.
Yes. So I do have a hardcover copy here. This is the cover. It does. So it's difficult really to talk too much about this book because it is a thriller. There are a lot of twists in it. Oftentimes thrillers, I think, have a lot of big reveals later in the novel. This one happens about maybe probably a good quarter of the way in. So I can really talk about the setup, which, yes, is about a businessman who goes out to Vegas for a couple days. Recently got divorced, feeling low. He goes out to Vegas to have a good time. And uh, one night he's out having fun. And the next morning he wakes up in a hotel room that's not his. There's a woman who appears to be dead in the bathtub. By all rights, it appears that he probably had something to do with killing her. And so he panics and runs. And that is the first like 2 or 3 chapters, I want to say.
Nice. It's like every sort of instinct that, the perfect setup for a book.
He definitely feels like, there's no way he did it. And he just doesn't know what else to do, because it also talks about how he has this switchblade. He comes to the city, he's by himself. Vegas is a seedy town, I think it's fair to say. And so he has the switchblade that he was walking around with for protection in case something ever happened to him. Well, the switchblade is there on the sink in the bathroom, and it's also a little bloody. So basically, there's a murder weapon that belongs to him.
Yeah, so pretty much all the evidence is definitely pointing against him.
Oh
So
yeah, definitely.
that's so I guess what inspired you to put the setting in Vegas?
So I always had the idea of this guy just waking up in a hotel room that's not his, because there is that disorienting feel of, you're already in a city that you're not familiar with, and you get used to your own hotel room sometimes. But he basically just the idea where you would wake up and not recognize the room you're in. And in this case, the room's a little bit of a mess, and he hears this just water kind of dripping from the bathroom, which is the thing that draws him over there, and where he finds that. Initially, I had talked to a travel agent friend of mine, because I basically told him the setup and what I wanted to do. And I said, where would be better to do this? Maybe Vegas, or maybe some type of like Caribbean paradise spot, something along the lines of, I don't know, just any type of Caribbean paradise spot. And ultimately, we settled on Vegas. I think had I set it in some type of Caribbean paradise spot, a lot of probably the first quarter of the book would have been very similar to the finished product of what The Killing Room became, but it also would have been a completely different book because the setting really played into, I mean, obviously there's just one, you're in the land. You don't have to worry about, getting, depending on like if you're on a little island or with whatever else. So I definitely was able to use Vegas and the surroundings to my advantage. But that also, the setting there really drove where the story went. Because again, I feel like had I said it there, it would have been a different book, but somewhat similar, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So I guess what kind of drove you to this plot line? Um, with your past novels and such, what makes this one stand out?
So what feels like forever ago, I had written this novel called Man of Wax. And in that case, it was a family man who lived in Pennsylvania, goes to bed one night with his wife. He also has a child in the home. And then he wakes up in a motel room in California with no memory of how he even got there. Disoriented, he goes to the bathroom. On the back of the bathroom door in blood is a message that says, "Let the game begin." So kind of a similar little bit of setup. I mean, and it is a standard thriller trope, I would say, this whole waking up, not knowing where you are. And quite honestly, I had this idea for The Killing Room, the initial seed for it a long time ago. And then Chris Bogelian's The Flight Attendant came out, the book. And I remember reading about what the book was about, and I thought, okay, well, there goes that idea. Because sometimes it's really just who gets there first. And so, but then I read The Flight Attendant and realized, okay, well, besides that little opening of just somebody waking up not knowing where they were, and it was completely different. So I felt confident that I could continue writing it, and that it wasn't going to be, too similar. But usually it's really hard to always kind of tell sometimes where seeds come from. Sometimes it's reading a news article or just hearing something in passing. You might hear two people talking about something, or you might be at the grocery store and just notice, the way somebody is acting. And it's always that what if. And so for me, it was just that what if, what if a man, in a town that's not familiar with him, wakes up, and again, just the whole setup of the book, wakes up in a hotel room that's not his to find a dead woman in the bathtub. What next? What's going to happen? Who is the guy? Who is the woman? Why is this happening? And then the story goes from there. And then, not to get too much about it, but even though that's the set, in terms of like writing thrillers and the twists and the turns of my novels, I really like messing with readers' expectations. So I like to really put you in a situation where you kind of think you know what's going on, but then you realize you have no idea what's going on. And so there are times where I feel like, by the first chapter, a reader will know exactly the type of novel this entire book is going to be. And there's nothing wrong with that. I've written several novels like that, but I also like the novels where you go into it expecting it's going to be one type of thing, and then at some point it just takes a turn, and then it becomes a completely different book. And so far, at least based on the reader reviews I've seen, people have really been responding to that, and they really like that because it's a little bit different that way.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like sometimes thrillers can get kind of pigeonholed, and you have these basic tropes that you have to follow, and when you don't necessarily follow those, that's when it's like, aha, you've kind of taken, the adventure into your own hands. So would you say, like, kind of walk us through, like, what is your process as a thriller writer? What sort of, do you tend to write out your whole draft and then look at it and be like, okay, I need to change things up? Or do you kind of just let it flow from the beginning?
Typically the latter. That book I'd mentioned before that I wrote a while ago called Man of Wax, that was one where I had just sat down and I wrote the entire book in 3 weeks, at least the first draft of the book in 3 weeks. And I really had no idea where I was going with it. So but and there are times where I will. So I like to I'd like to steal Harlan Coben's. I forget, he has a saying where it was almost like the way he writes is it's like taking a road trip. So he knows he's starting, he knows where he's starting, and he knows where he wants to end up. So he's on a road trip. He knows, it's Harlan Coben, so it's going to be in Jersey, but he wants to go out to California. He knows, he has a general idea where he wants to go, but he doesn't really know how he's going to get there, what route he's going to take, and what's going to happen along the way. And so oftentimes that's very similar. Usually starting, I'll be thinking about an idea for a while. Very rarely, sometimes there are times where I might just have the initial thing, like I mentioned, the Man of Wax, where I'll just sit down with the first chapter and then just go. And I don't really know, I just let the story take me wherever it will go. But then there are other times where I'll think about it for a while, especially in this case, if I'm going to pitch my agent or like tell her like, hey, I have this idea I was thinking about working on it. We might talk about it. But typically I don't really work from an outline. I try to do the Nora Roberts vomit draft process, where I just really like to try to get that first draft out as soon as I can. Really just let the story take over, let the characters take over, and really dictate how the story will go. I've always just enjoyed that more. Usually, as the writer, if I'm surprised by what's happening, I feel the reader will definitely be surprised. And then sometimes, we get to a certain place where I realize, okay, at this stage in the book, maybe 3/4 in, this needs to happen so that on a rewrite later, I want to set up some type of foreshadowing or whatever else. Like it's all in the revision process of it. But so I also write under a pen name. I write like psychological suspense under the pen name Avery Bishop, and I had an Audible original that had come out, and we had sold a second Audible original. Initially, it was going to be for about a 30,000 word novella, and that was something where I wrote a couple chapters and we outlined it, a very detailed outline. And we sold it. So then I sat down, I started writing it, and as I was writing it, I realized, okay, everything in this outline is going to be there. But to really make this effective, to make this work, I'm going to have to add in a lot more stuff. And what was pitched initially as about a 30,000 word novella became like 60,000 words. So, and again, that kind of goes to the idea that even having an outline, and that's why I don't really like outlining. I really like just like going into the story and letting the story, tell it as it is, because in that case, we, I don't know, probably would have got paid a little bit more had we known it was going to be for a novel and not a novella. But it is what it is. For me, it's always about just, telling the best story you can.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned Harlan Coben, Danielle Steele. Do you have other authors that you kind of not necessarily take inspiration from, but find that they're helpful, or rather, like when you're getting charged up to write another novel, do you binge read a certain author?
Off the top of my head, I try to read in all different types of genres. Of course, Nora Roberts, I'm not really I would say a romance fan, but I will read some of her. And a lot of her, I mean, she obviously does the J.D. Robb novels, which I've read several of those, and even her other books. I think like Shelter in Place is one that I know that came out a couple years ago. It's essentially, you could say it's a thriller. It has a lot of thriller elements, but obviously it is a romance novel as well. And a lot of literary stuff. A lot of thrillers of crime. Dennis Lehane is one that comes to mind. Robert Crace, I really like Robert Crace's more when she does the Elvis Cole and Joe Pike novels. A lot of his more recent novels, his writing style I really like, in terms of a lot of white space on the page. He tries to keep dialogue on its own line, so you don't have the exposition and dialogue in the same paragraph, which is something that I've started gravitating towards. Usually though, I try not to read a certain writer like that while I'm actually writing, because I will find myself almost maybe unconsciously mirroring their style. So I try to, not not I don't want to like make it seem like I'm just copying, another writer's style, but I think there are certain aspects of certain writer styles where I will kind of take from the same way, like movie directors, they'll take, certain aspects of one director's techniques, and they'll like add that to their own repertoire, I guess you could say. And
Yeah.
the same thing, I mean, we'll even throw out James Patterson. I know that sometimes people want to give James Patterson a hard time. I really enjoy his books. I mean, some are better than others. Um, and people also want to give him a hard time just for the short chapters. But honestly, that's just how it is nowadays. I feel that most people, when they sit down, they're going to see how many pages is this chapter, because people don't really have a lot of time to read nowadays because they have a lot of other things that they would rather be doing, just watching TV, playing on the computer. So if they sit down and they look and say, oh, this chapter is 30 pages, I don't have time for that. And then they don't read the book. But they might sit down and say, oh, this chapter's 3 pages. Okay. So they read that. And then they say, oh, the next chapter is 4 pages. And then they, before they realize it, they end up reading 50 pages when they didn't think they had time to read 30 pages. So it is this weird psychological thing. So I often times try to, I try to keep my chapters on the shorter end if possible. There are times where I think the chapters will be longer, oftentimes just because I don't feel like I want to break something up in the middle of the action or whatever else just for chapter length's sake. But I do try to keep the chapters on a shorter level, just knowing, again, psychologically how it works in readers' heads, to know, because as ideally you just want to keep them just turning the pages or clicking on their e-reader to go to the next page.
That's actually a really interesting point because I think the other night as I was reading in bed, I'm like, can I make through one more chapter? And I like turned to see how many pages. And yeah, I totally base that off of, could I get another chapter in? Is it 3 pages? Is it 20 pages? So that's a fantastic point. And then it's like,
I think most readers aren't even aware that they do it, but I think most
yeah,
readers do it. And again, so as a writer, it's just really kind of taking that to my advantage, where to keep people reading, not only having a little bit of cliffhangers on a chapter, but to the place where you just have to just, okay, what happens in the next chapter? What happens in the next chapter? What happens in the next chapter? And again, ideally you get to a place where someone then reads 100 pages of a book when they didn't think they had time to read 20.
yeah, no, definitely. And it's almost kind of like if you've got that short chapter, then you can like, it's almost like if you have kind of a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter, it almost seems like if you're thinking it in terms of could this make for a good TV or movie, it's like now it's commercial break and then you got the end of the chapter. And so I guess what inspired you to essentially, or have you always wanted to be a thriller writer? Or was this kind of a genre that you never thought that you wanted to write in and just kind of had this idea fall in your lap?
So I would say for me, one of the big inspirations is when I was in 6th grade and the first Jurassic Park movie came out. And then that's how, and I'd always been a reader up to that. I'd read a lot of Hardy Boys books and other type of books like that. But once Jurassic Park came out in the 6th grade, I just started reading every Michael Crichton novel I could get my hands on, even his pen name titles. I remember like The Case of Need, by the pen name right now is I can't think it off the top of my head. It's not the John Lang books, but I was really digging into all the types of Michael Crichton. And from there, my very first, I think I was in 8th grade, my very first Stephen King novel was Insomnia, which if anybody's read Insomnia is probably not the best introductory to Stephen King. But I love the book, and I knew at that point, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to write books like this. It was just a great book. And because of that, it probably remains one of my favorites just because of that. And because of that, I really just kind of felt, okay, I want to be a horror writer. So a lot of my early stuff is horror, supernatural, speculative. And even my early novels lean towards that way. Even so, I have at least two unpublished novels that probably would never dig back out, but those are definitely horror, supernatural. But I think they all have the aspect of a thriller in them. And so I had even come up with a lot of horror friends. I mean, I still have a lot of horror friends or writer friends that I hang out with. So I'm still kind of, I guess, in the horror scene, although I don't really write that stuff anymore. Not that I don't like it, it's just I kind of find myself just again gravitating more towards the thriller aspect. But I remember being somewhere. I think it was a friend's birthday up in New York City, and a lot of writer friends were there. And two writer friends had pulled me aside, and again, they were mostly all horror writers. And they sat me down and were like, why are you hanging out with us? Or like, you're not a thriller, or you're not a horror writer. And I at first I felt very, I don't know, I felt very insulted because I was like, what are you talking about? Of course I am. But in retrospect, I could see what they meant because a lot of my stuff was just, it was almost like I was forcing the horror aspects or the supernatural aspects into stuff that was more crime or thriller. And so I would say a lot of my earlier novels, like The Serial Killer's Wife, it's a thriller, but it has horror elements. This, I mean, because it's about a serial killer. So like the same way Silence of the Lambs is like a horror novel. Or then No Shelter, one of my very earlier novels, is about a female assassin who works for like a black ops United States government thing. Or even Man of Wax, it's a very dark thriller. So I will say that it just I kind of really just embraced that aspect of writing thrillers or crime. Um, but I think there were still aspects where it was also very dark. So like Man of Wax can be a very, very dark novel, even though it's a thriller. If I were to write Man of Wax nowadays, there are maybe some elements that maybe for shock value, I would probably pull back on. Um, just because, especially understanding more how general thriller audiences are, where I think that they're okay going into little dark places, and we mentioned we even mentioned Nora Roberts, like Shelter Place is essentially about a mass shooter, or even a lot of James Patterson, killers galore in pretty much all of his books. So I think a lot of general thriller readers are okay going into dark places, but sometimes I think there is a line where there can be too much. And so that is something I also try to I keep in the back of my head.
So have you always wanted to be a writer?
Uh, I will say again, I remember in sixth grade, the whole Jurassic Park thing. I remember writing a short story for some type of I think it was like a history. Um, I want to say was it a history class or some type of, for the assignment. It was a very, very short story. And um I remember enjoying that. And I remember the criticism I got from one of the teachers because, not knowing any better, I had said, "Oh, something was going on. It was almost like World War III." And she's like, "Well, at this point, it would not be World War III. It would still been, because I forget when it was set, but she was like, it would be World War One." And so I was already getting, critiqued very early on. But from there, again, going back to the about around eighth grade, reading that Insomnia by Stephen King was when I really, really solidified it. And that's when I just found myself writing more short stories. I think I even written probably I guess a novella length. It was, because I had been told too, like, well, you can't just start off writing novels, because that's what I wanted to do. I was like, oh, I want to write a novel. And everyone was like, well, you got to write short stories first, which, yeah, okay, it was probably good advice. Also, again, being in kind of the horror genre with a lot of different writer friends, I ended up being, I guess my official title was the senior editor for this one horror fantasy magazine. So I read a lot of slush, and slush basically is just unsolicited manuscripts that were coming into the magazine, which I found that for anybody who wants to be a reader, if you can be a slush reader, it's very, very, very beneficial, because you can see, because it got to the point where I could just tell by the first page whether or not a story was going to be worth reading. Um, and sometimes you can tell by the first line or paragraph. And so that I felt really helped make me as a writer become a stronger writer, at least a more thoughtful and detailed writer. Plus, at the same time, also just seeing, the cover letters people were sending in, and so knowing then, when I was submitting my own stuff, how, yeah, how to approach editors for like unsolicited purposes.
So I guess kind of jumping back to your books, do you have a favorite character that you have written or worked with, or even one that hasn't even come out yet or has been, locked away in an old manuscript?
I have to say, I think in all of the interviews I've ever done, I don't think anyone ever asked if I had a favorite character. So thank you for that. That's the first
Yeah.
one I've had. So I've never really thought about it that way. I guess, um, I don't know. That's a very good question. I mean, I guess, oftentimes people when they'll ask like, "What's your favorite book?" It's always, they're all children, so you'd always say
Yeah.
probably the most recent child. So maybe the first, the main character of the most recent novel. It is the first book in a series or a potential series. So I mean, the second novel is completed. It has been turned into the publisher, and basically, I think almost all edits. I mean, we're going to get to the copy edit stage next month or in December. Um, so I do like that character. It was one of those things too where that character really changed as I was writing the book, and so having having the groundwork in book one and going into book two, it was also beneficial just to help grow that character too and add more backstory. Um, but I guess I can mention yeah, I mean, yeah, I have that Man of Wax book. It was a trilogy, although there's also a prequel. But the main character in there was one that I think of often. I would not return to that series because I want to say the series is done. But a lot of the characters, I guess, I could you mention them and I could immediately just think about everything that happened to them in those books. I've oftentimes heard readers or some writers would say that they will get to a place where they can't stand their characters because they keep writing, they're reading the manuscript again and again and again, and then they get sick of their characters and they just want to get done with the book. And I always found that weird because because I always feel like, well, if you as the writer get to a place where you get annoyed with your own characters and get sick of your own characters, even well, how are readers going to feel? Because I will have times where I'll readers, they'll read, and it's very nice to hear this, but they'll read some of my books several times, and I'm pretty sure no one probably has read these books more than I've read them because I, draft by draft by draft, I will read it again and again and again to try to make sure it's as good as it can be. It gets to a place sometimes where I'm even on like a line level. And I remember working with a developmental editor on book two for the Killing Room series. He even said he's like, this is almost like poetry level stuff because I was going down to like, well, does this word in this sentence would be better to change it to this word for the rhythm? And he's like, dude, come on. He was like, we're not, we like don't worry about stuff like that. And I can't really help it. I try to make sure it has that it has that flow. Obviously it's not poetry, but at the same time where I always feel that there are times where you might be reading a sentence or a paragraph and then you get to a word or you get to like a comma, and then it disrupts the flow. It is something about it, like even if you're not even reading out loud of obviously, or there's just something about it where it's distracting and it takes you as the reader out even for like a second. And so, it's just that idea of trying to make yourself as the reader more or less disappear. And you're just telling the story, but you're not getting to a place where the reader knows the author is telling the story, if that makes any sense. And then, of course, it's a fan favorite, Holly Lynn. She's the Holly Lynn series. That's one that I will continue on whenever I find time. There is going to be several more books in that series.
So do you So in the process of your writing, do you often find yourself like, do you gather all of your notes? Is there a research process when you're getting ready for a new book or a new series? And this book based in Las Vegas, did you do a business expense and go out to Vegas and like kind of wander around, or do you just kind of take the creative outlet in that and just research at home or
So I definitely don't like research to get in the way of the story. And the reason I say that is there are times where it feels like some writers, they will spend months doing research before they even write one page, which is fine. But sometimes then it feels like that writer spent all that time doing the research. And because they spent all that time doing the research, they don't want all that time to go to waste. So then they just put in all this information into the books. And for me, it's more I want to just get into the story. And then so when I get to certain places, then I'll maybe take some time and do the research. So in terms of Vegas, it would have been nice had I had the time to go out to Vegas and walk around. But really, and I had been there. It's been a long time since I've been to Vegas, but um, basically Google Earth has been a godsend, I want to say, for a lot of writers. Like even I mentioned the Holly Lynn books, No Shelter. There's a section that takes place in Paris, and even then, using Google Earth, knowing certain spots, and then you can even be on that block. Now granted, sometimes this stuff hasn't been updated in a certain amount of time, but so with the killing room, obviously it takes place in Vegas. There's one scene where he gets dropped off at Caesar's palace, and then he crosses over one of the streets to go to where he's been staying at the Bellagio. In Google Earth, I was able to see like, okay, there is a Starbucks there on the corner. And not only is there a Starbucks there on the corner, there's a little trash can there. So at one point, this character, he throws something away in this trash can that was there. Because when I'm writing something that is set in an actual place, I try to, if possible, make it as as real as I can. I love just creating a town or some type of place where no one is going to then call me out later and be like, well, there's no way, that was a one-way street. How are they going up that street? So even I remember when I had wrote in Man of Wax, where again, he wakes up in this motel room in California, and I forget it was on what highway they were. I think it was the Pacific Coast Highway. In that section, and this was really even before Google Earth. God, I feel so old. So I called one of the hotel or motels along that highway and said something stupid like, I was doing a school project, and can you confirm what the speed limit is out there, because I wanted to make sure, say like this is what the speed limit is along that highway. So again, there is that type of research that's been done, but I will say I want to say I'm a lazy researcher, but I know that's probably not the case because I do really dig in when I need to. But I am not the type of person who is, getting on a plane and spending a week or two in Paris just to, get a sense of the place and the smell of the nearby bakeries to add that like extra texture to the book. Just because one, I don't have the time for it. But and the same thing too with weapons. I found, if there are any authors who are out there, God forbid you screw up any type of thing with guns or weapons, you will get called out very quickly and sometimes with force. So there are some of my earlier books where I had to go back and kind of update certain things that I knew that I did just not do the proper research. So I know that this time, and especially in this, weapons do play in somewhat heavily in this novel. So I wanted to make sure that not only do I have the right type of weapons used, but oh, actually, that was something to mention for anybody who would be interested. I was at Thriller Fest earlier this year, and Jack Carr was in conversation with Brad Thor, and something that Jack Carr had said I found very interesting. And anybody's not aware, Jack Carr writes the James Reese novels. The first novel was the thriller. The Terminal List was turned into a TV show with Chris Pratt on Prime. Um, and Jack Carr used to be a Navy SEAL, and he had said that a character's what was it? A character's gear tells a story. So and how he explained that was like a character might carry a certain type of pistol or a certain type of knife or how he carried himself, and based on that he could tell like, okay, that person used to be maybe in Delta or used to be a Navy SEAL, or just because these men and women, they train with certain weapons, and oftentimes then when they get into civilian life, they continue using those type of weapons. And so that was something in the back of my head. I was like, okay, that's very interesting. So I have in book 2 of the follow-up to The Killing Room, there is a character who is a sniper, and so I realized a little bit of his backstory. I looked into the type of sniper rifles they use to train with, and they used in the field. And so in the civilian life, it's very, very small. I mean, it doesn't really like factor in, like in a major way. But again, it's just that's those little small details. I wanted to make sure that, okay, he would most likely be using the same type of sniper rifle, you know, much later in life. So yeah, that type of thing I found very interesting and something I've tried to be a little bit more conscious of.
Nice. Yeah, I could definitely see that if you get a finite detail of a certain, especially a certain make and model of a gun, that people could easily come at you and be like, no, that sight scope wouldn't exist on XY gun. So I could definitely see.
And plus I'm not really a gun guy, so it's not like yeah, so it's almost very foreign, but I definitely do the research, and gun manufacturers make it very easy to see the specs. So especially writing, these types of books, these types of thrillers, almost, I don't want to say they're, well, maybe they could somewhat lean into more the military thrillers, and not being even a military person. It's one of those things where I definitely, you want to make it right, because again, that idea where it takes the reader out, people who know about weapons, if they get to that spot and they realize, okay, this, all right, well, this author obviously has no idea what he's talking about, then they just might put the book down. So it's really just trying to find that authenticity.
Yeah. Yeah. And just got a chat from Betsy. She said, yeah, readers will definitely call you out on that. Um, yeah, the believability. I think if anybody catches that one minute, tiny little miss missed detail, definitely. Um, I personally make notations, not in my library books, but my personal copies. Um, and it doesn't even have to be anything negative. I always read with a pen or a pencil by me. And anytime I lend a book out, I'm always telling people, I'm really sorry, I write in my books. But yeah, I could see where, people would definitely. So and you write a quite a different array of main characters. Do you find that you impart a piece of yourself in all of them, or do you see yourself in any of these main characters that you create?
I want to say no, but probably yes, especially because some of my characters are really evil, and they do really terrible things. I I don't know. I just try to make the characters as three-dimensional as possible. Even if they're a secondary or tertiary character. And that was something that I'd even got into a conversation with the developmental editor for the follow-up to The Killing Room, because I had almost said, like, are all of these characters too rounded? Because some of the characters, again, are not necessarily major characters, but if they were on the page, I wanted them to be as real as possible, not just um I guess like in terms of like John Wick movies, he's just killing people left and right, and there's no emotional connection to the viewer to any of the people he's killing, well, except for I guess the main bad people. But a lot of them are, they're just henchmen. And so it's really funny. I don't know if everybody remembers. I think it was the very first Austin Powers movie. I think it was a deleted scene where Austin Powers had killed one of the henchmen, and it was this cutaway to basically like this nameless henchman's family, where they got word that their father was killed, and everyone was crying, and it was just kind of funny. Where it was just this idea, and I remember even writing a very this flash fiction piece where I think it was called uh, "The Life of a Tertiary Character," where it was basically just this. It was a very like again, it was a flash fiction piece, very short, where it just talked about this character whose only sole existence was just to help propel the plot. There really had no other existence beyond just, being in the right place at the right time to tell the protagonist, something useful. Um, so I don't really know where I was going with that. What was the question again?
Do you see yourself in any of like
Do I
any
see
of your
myself?
characters?
Yes and no. I guess I'll say that. I will say that that oftentimes my characters can be a little sardonic, and I'm that way in real life. So oftentimes there's usually a little sarcastic flair, in there. But um, probably my very first novel, and that's usually the case for a lot of writers. Their very first books, the main characters oftentimes mirror themselves. I mean, the main character in that was an 18-year-old kid. At the time I was in, I think I wrote that like in college, so that was very close to where I was. um but then the Avery Bishop stuff, those are more those books are more female oriented suspense, kind of like the JP Delaney, Riley Sager novels. In fact, I even told Riley Sager when I saw him, I was like, if it wasn't for you, I probably would have ended up with initials as a pen name, like the JP Delaney or the SJ Watson. But when I realized, like, okay, I could just do a gender neutral pen name, perfect. But in those, the main characters are all women. Even my Holly Lynn books. I mean, Holly Lynn's a woman, so um, are there maybe parts of my personality in any of those characters? Maybe, if I really dug down deep, but it's one of those things where I never really think about it, so it's more of an unconscious thing. Um, I just really try to make the characters just as real as possible with their own backstory, their own motivations. But I would say, yeah, I mean, as the author, there's always going to be pieces, no matter how slight, probably, of the author and in all the characters.
So you say that so you write in both perspectives of a female main character and a male main character. Do you find one easier than the other?
I don't know.
Or
There,
is it just
not, I
like
mean,
it
not
just has to
not
depend on
really.
the
I
character?
sometimes, yes, sometimes you'll have writers say, I just can't write in the voice of another character. I try not to overthink things. If I have a story idea, and I know that, okay, the story is going to be told from this one character's point of view, I just do it. And again, a lot of it kind of falls back on the revision end. There are times, especially, I think writers need to always understand that their first drafts are going to be crappy. No one ever writes a perfect first draft. And I think once you get past that and understand, okay, the first draft is going to be bad. It's supposed to be bad. There's a freedom in that, so you don't feel pressured to make sure every word that gets put down on the page is going to be perfect. And again, once you get past that, it feels, at least for me, it becomes a little bit freer. And so there are times where, yeah, the character from the first draft might not be the same exact character that's going to end up in sixth or seventh draft or whatever is the final version that comes out. And there might be certain aspects of that character that will change or tweak. Um, in fact, quite honestly, we even talk about the book we we're talking about, The Killing Room. This was not the title that the book was shopped around. The very first working title for the book that I'd written under was Blackout, and then we shopped it around to publishers as Sleeper. And the publisher didn't really care for that title, and then so me and the development editor were trying to come up with a better title. And when we came up with the title of The Killing Room, even though there that played into it, that didn't really play into it as heavily as what this draft does. So that was just on the revision. We're really putting it in there. And so one author friend of mine, when I told him that, he was very surprised to hear that, because he was like, the book it just felt right that, oh, like, of course, from the very beginning, you knew that this was the title and this was how it was going to play into. And it was like, no, that was something on the revision. So, and that's the thing too, just again, revision. I love the revision process. One of my Avery Bishop books, literally probably the last, I don't know, probably the last quarter of it, was what I turned in was not what the finished product was. You know, it was just working with the editor and the developmental editor, just on the revision process to just really make sure all the T's were crossed, the I's were dotted, and everything worked. So, but and the same thing too with writing from a female point of view. I never really think about like, oh, I'm a man, like I can't do this. It's just, I just do it. I don't really think about it. I don't know. I just, sometimes I think writers get really into their own heads, and they make themselves start second guessing it, where I don't know. I just never really overthink it. Of course, now I am going to overthink it. So, thank you. So, but
No
no, that's
problem.
okay.
Well, I just think it's interesting because, uh, authors who can change back and forth, or there's authors who are just like, nope, I'm only writing in a male perspective. That's what I can do. But it's interesting that you're able to write back and forth. Um, but in answering another chat question here, are there any women who actually inspire your, women characters, your female characters in any of your books?
Um, so I will say that a lot of my earlier stuff was more male driven. And I'm trying to remember, I think my wife had pointed it out at the time that, you don't really write anything from a female point of view, or like have like a female main character. And so her name is Holly, her name's Holly Lynn, Lyn. And I had said jokingly, like, oh, okay, well, I should write a book maybe about like a female assassin called Holly Lynn. And in her mind, she saw that as Lin. She's like, okay, like an Asian person. And I was like, oh. And so No Shelter was kind of the first thing that kind of came from that. Mostly the inspiration. And then I wrote The Serial Killer's Wife, and I had written several other books. And then, of course, again, a lot of the Avery Bishop stuff has been from a female point of view. I don't really know if I could say that a lot of them was inspired specifically by certain people. Um, Even a lot of my, like The Killing Room was not really inspired by anyone I really know. Again, it's more, I think, just putting characters in certain situations and seeing how they will react. Um, and also, if anybody has seen the show Barry, I remember seeing an interview with Bill Hader, and he had talked. And I think one of the reasons the show felt so fresh is oftentimes they will put characters in situations, and whatever the viewer would expect them to do, they would make sure that the characters did the opposite. So I won't say that I do that all the time, but there are times where I try to, again, play with those reader expectations, where you kind of think where things are going, and then all of a sudden it kind of goes in a different direction, or the character doesn't necessarily do what you expect. Because you know oftentimes this type of fiction is formulaic. It usually does follow a certain act structure, and I think in the one hand, readers have come to almost readers, they like that in a way, even though they'll say that they don't, but they keep flocking back to the same type of novels, the same type of characters. um I do write a few different series, but I like writing standalones. I don't know how certain authors, like, God bless, Lee Child and the Jack Reacher novels, like, I don't know if I could just write the same character for 20 years. I just feel like I would get very bored. I think he did. I mean, that's one of the reasons he was kind of retired and have his head, handed it off to his brother. Um, but yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
So I guess we'll get a couple questions in here and then we'll kind of see if our attendees want to ask some questions. So one of the questions I usually like to ask authors is, what is on your to be read pile right now?
What am I currently reading, or what is on my to be read pile? Because my to be read pile, my office, I mean, you can see a little bit of some books here. I have, my wife hates it. It's literally a book wasteland. I just have books everywhere. There's no rhyme or
I'm the
reason to
same
a lot of
way.
the piles. What I'm currently reading right now, and I try to read a lot of different things. So I actually just finished an audiobook today. Matthew Cork's Hour of the Assassin. I just finished that audiobook. It was a very fun, fast-paced novel. I usually try to read either a novel in paperback or hardcover. And that one is actually 12 Months to Live by James Patterson and Mike Lupica. Um, Usually I read something on my Kindle, but I'm actually reading right now a book that's going to be coming out, I think, next year. They had reached out to me for a blurb, the publisher. I don't really want to say what the book is, just to jinx it for the author or anything.
Right.
And also I try to read also like a short story collection on top of that. So the short story collection I'm reading right now is The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by
Yeah.
Disha Filya. And usually, because with short story collections, I don't know sometimes how people were just able to sit down and read 4 or 5 short stories in a day. Like I'd like to just read a story here and there, kind of let it simmer. So short story collections are one of those things I just have on my desk, and I'll just every other day maybe I'll read a story. Of course, it goes back to that thing too. Like, well, if the story is 50 pages long, I don't know if I have time to read this. But this story is 10, 15 pages. Yeah, okay. So some short story collections are a little bit easier to get through than others. In terms of other stuff on my desk that I picked up recently, let me see here. Brian Washington's new book I picked up. I really enjoyed his collection a lot, and Memorial was his first novel that came out. I got the Jordan Peele. This will probably be the next short story collection I read, which is just actually an anthology. But Jordan Peele, the one that he edited, Out There Screaming. Also Paul Tremblay's new book. I recently chatted with Laura Sims. Her most recent book, which as a library, I'm sure I think it's been a hit with libraries. But how can I help you? That takes place in a library. Yeah, again, we could be here for 3 hours just talking about the books I have in my office, and that doesn't even count the books on my Kindle. God, probably never going to get through all those either.
Yeah. I mean, it's just stockpiling for, a snow in or whatever. Yeah. So I guess last question. What are you binge watching on TV, Netflix, Amazon, Hulu? What series can't you stop watching?
So not long ago, my wife and I had watched The Diplomat on Netflix. We enjoyed that. Right now, we're watching Beef on Netflix. Um, I think we're catching up on season 3 of. We had been watching the morning show, so we watched a couple of episodes of that recently. But I'm also getting to a place where I'm not going to be watching a lot of TV because I'm going to be diving back into a new project. So really, they don't really have a lot of time for TV. So I try not to, because there are some other shows that we want to, we kind of have like waiting to watch, but we haven't. I don't want to run a start on it just because. And I feel bad because then, we might watch an episode and then not get back to it for like another several weeks or whatever else. Um, what are some other shows that are that we've been Loki is one that we've been kind of keeping up with. And then there's always, we try to always watch like a dumb sitcom type show to just like kill the time, for like 20 minutes, maybe like here and there. And what did we watch recently? Oftentimes, I think we had gone through like Community was one, but I think now we're actually watching Cougar Town. And that was mostly because I had been on a Bill Lawrence kick. So I was like, you know what? I'd seen Scrubs, and obviously there was his, Ted Lasso, and there was what was Shrinking, and for whatever reason, we never watched Cougar Town, but I was like, okay, it's on Hulu, so we were watching that. It's a fun show.
Fantastic. All right. So, does anybody have any questions? If you want to go ahead and throw them in the chat function, or I can, if you want to unmute yourself, or if you have the capability of doing that. If not, I can try and do that. But
can you hear me, Kelly?
yeah.
Oh, yay! My phone is being so weird. I'm so glad I was able to stop in. And it first logged me in as the library. I'm like, oh no. So hi, Robert. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm so
Absolutely.
happy that, thank you. I'm so happy because Kelly is like the best fill-in ever because she's a writer herself. So she asks all the nice, deep questions. When you get me, it's all frivolous. It's like completely. So this is a great interview. My biggest, I loved your book and I listened to it on audio through Libby, and I absolutely loved Eduardo Ballerini, and I'm so excited that that's who you had. And I'm also listening, I just started Grisham's new novel, The Exchange, listening to it on audio too, and he's also the narrator for that one. So it's very exciting. So I'm so happy that you got such a great narrator, because narrators can definitely make or break a book, I think, when you're listening to it, for sure.
Absolutely. And just a quick thing. Yeah. So Eduardo Ballerini does the audiobook. I had a wish list of narrators that I'd given the publisher initially, because Blackstone is an audiobook publisher. That's what they do primarily. They just recently got into doing print stuff more in the last couple of years. And so I had a wish list of narrators. Eduardo was on there. And what happened was when they had sent me some samples because they were gearing up to do the audiobook, they had sent me the samples, and none of the samples they sent me were any of the authors on my wish list. And long story short, it turned out that the producer had never even received that wish list. So when I had mentioned, I was like, well, could we look to, maybe, because all the samples were fine, but I was like, could we look to maybe do one of these other people or see if they're available? And anyway, long story short, yeah, Eduardo was able to come on, and I really pushed for Eduardo just because the way, and Betsy, if you have listened to the book, so that you're aware of kind of, again, the setup and then where it kind of goes. I really liked Eduardo just because he can play a lot of different characters, a lot of different moods. And I thought, especially with the first, I guess, probably two hours of the novel, he could play it perfectly. And then again, go in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, listening to your voice too, I think you're hitting it out of the park being a writer. But if you wanted to do narrating, I think you could do that as well.
Well, thank you. I'll have to mention it to the publisher. Good to know.
Oh, sure.
That would be some. That would be a moonlighting as an audiobook narrator. Perfect. Well, yeah,
exactly.
That's the thing too. That's very kind of you to say, but that's the thing too with audio narrators. They're not just narrating. Okay. Some do just narrate, but I find the best ones, and this is what Eduardo does, and it's other narrators like I don't know, like Scott Brick or Ray Porter, or even like Julia Whalen or Brittany Presley, they perform the novel. It's not just them reading the novel, because like you said, yes, some narrators make or break a novel. Like, oh man, there are some books I will not listen to the audiobook because of the narrator, or I will check out the sample first, and the sample is just well, actually, Betsy, you would appreciate this. So for whatever reason, on Audible, when the book first came out, the sample was like chapter 35. And so, at that point, it's after the major reveal. And I had to reach out to the publisher and being like, could we, make the sample something earlier in the book before you get to like the major reveal? And and they were able to change that. I think they just went to chapter 1, but I was like, why are we just doing chapter 35? I mean, especially even that little section, it was like a minute long. Like it even like gave away, someone paying attention. So yeah, that kind of drove me nuts.
Yeah, that would drive me crazy. I just have two more comments. One is I love that you mentioned, some of the authors that you like James Patterson, Harlan Coben, Jack Carr, those kind of people. And you're reading 12 Months to Live by Patterson, which I just listened to that as well. But that was my first thought because I read your book before I listened to that one. And Mike Lupica is actually who you reminded me of. I'm not the biggest fan of James Patterson. I like his early stuff, but not his late stuff. But Mike Lupica's stuff, even with Patterson or by himself, that's what yours reminded me of. So I like that connection that you said also. Also, I remember in your bio, you talked about hint fiction.
Yes.
That you kind of pen that, I guess. And what hint fiction kind of reminds me of, and Kelly will know this, is that it kind of reminds me of NaNoWriMo. Are you familiar with that, National Novel Writing Month?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what hint fiction kind of is like, seems like the beginning of something like that people could, write something like that and then go further in National Novel Writing Month and then even go further and hopefully get their novel published. So I kind of like those little baby steps. I'm not a writer, but that's how I would do it.
Yeah. Well, so real quick, yeah, James Patterson novels, again, they can be hit and miss. I often find it really depends on the co-author. David Ellis is one where I always find that David Ellis's co-written novels with Patterson are really good. So if you ever checked out David Ellis, and I think he had a recent book come out, I think Putnam put it out or something like, I think last year. That was a standalone. In terms of hidden fiction, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but yes, that was inspired by the Ernest Hemingway 6-word story, For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. Really the whole thing kind of started off as a joke, a very facetious idea of like, oh, we're gonna create this literary term. But yeah, I mean, I know some like colleges or high schools will like, include that in terms of like the writing programs, or at least like a little mini course. And sometimes we'll use it as prompts or just, try to write a story. Because again, the idea is how short can you make a story until it's no longer considered a story? And that was kind of the main question that the anthology had proposed, that Norton had put out, at least it's been over a decade now. It's been a long time, it feels like.
Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate you being here. I'll let other people speak.
No, and thank you again for Betsy for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And of course,
Nice.
Kelly, thank you again for all the great questions.
Oh,
What do you write, Kelly?
Well, I've written a couple of murder mystery novels.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, I myself am gearing up for NaNoWriMo in a couple of days. So yeah. It's been a couple
The
years
thing
since
about NaNoWriMo, I always like to tell people, is you don't have to wait till November. NaNoWriMo can be any day of the year.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think it's also kind of like, it's kind of that challenge. I've been working on a couple drafts of the two that I've finished, and I kind of pick away at them, and I feel like I have this other idea kind of brewing in my head, so I'm getting away from a genre that I've been writing in, murder mysteries, for a while now, and we'll see. I'm gonna write a romance novel, so we'll see how it goes.
Those do sell really well. One thing I remember Walter Mosley had said with him, when he knows a book is done, he'll work on the draft and he'll make little changes here and there, and then he'll work again, make little changes here and there, and then when he gets to a place where he can't make any more changes, the story's done. So I always really thought about like, okay, that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that is really great, and yeah, definitely. My characters always kind of come to me, and the story kind of morphs. It's quite complex, and so sometimes I feel like I get in over my head and have to be like, all right, I need to back away for a minute, and then it'll brew in my brain and more will come out. So
Right.
yeah. Dustin.
Yeah, hi. I'm talking to you live from Oregon, so it's not quite dark here, but it's making me look really dark. I apologize. I'm not trying to be creepy. I wrote down a couple things while you were talking. Number one, big fan. Have all your, I think all your books, the short story collections, and all of it. So
Thank you, Dustin.
yeah, I started out with Man of Wax, and there's a very few authors I follow that dedicatedly. When something comes out, I get it day one, but you're definitely one of them. So
oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, hopefully that makes you feel good. True. One thing you reminded me of is there's this book called The War with Grandpa that I read when I was probably 10 or 11. And the first chapter, the main character writing the book is a boy fighting with his grandpa. And he says, this book is going to have lots of short chapters because I think that makes a book go faster. And that always stuck with me in my head. And what you were talking about earlier about short chapters, I think you're spot on. It just, you hit a cliffhanger, you're like, I got time for 6 more pages, and then it keeps happening. So those little cliffhangers at the end of each chapter are great. Really like that part of your writing. The second thing you reminded me of, Orson Scott Card wrote about in one of his books on how to write about horror. You were talking about horror versus thriller, and he said there's 3 kinds of scary writing. There's dread, where you don't know what you're scared of, but you know something bad is coming. And that's what you get like with Man of Wax or Serial Killer's Wife. They don't really know what's going on. Terror is when you see what's happening, you can see it coming at you and you have to react to it. And then horror is when you see the aftermath, the blood and guts that are left over after something terrible happens. And your thrillers tend to have all 3 of those in them. So I would consider them horror mixed in there, horror and dread and terror kind of mixed together with your thrillers. So whoever says you don't write horror, it's probably not completely accurate, because I think those are mixed in. That dread, that feeling, you wake up and you don't know what's going on and you know your child is missing. That's scary. It's definitely horror to me. So wanted to point that out. The last thing, the story similarities, I started reading this new book, The Killing Room, the day it came out, and I was like, oh, we're in a hotel room with someone who doesn't know what's going on. This is a Man of Wax. What? I'm reading Man of Wax again. But then it splits, right? You probably felt like, I assume you felt like that when you're writing it. I had the same thing when I read The Serial Killer's Wife. I was like, I'm reading Man of Wax again. What is happening? Someone on the earpiece telling someone what to do. But they veer off after that first little spark enough that it's not a problem at all. I thought, oh no, I'm going to read the same story, but it wasn't at all. So I appreciate it. I commend you for disappointing me for a few sentences and then going off somewhere else that surprised me. So just wanted to point that out. It's the similarities are there and I see them, but it's okay. It doesn't really bother me.
No, I totally, trust me, it crossed my mind too. There are certain things which, again, they're very, very standard, thriller setups, which I kind of felt that it was okay because, again, knowing that it was going to go in a completely different direction, just using that as like a catapulting, like the first chapter type thing. But I totally get what you're talking about, because it definitely crossed my mind. And it's interesting what you said before about what Orson Card or Scott Card had said, because when I had started doing some of the Avery Bishop stuff, being a thriller writer trying to write suspense, I remember my editor had really kind of given me a little bit of a schooling in terms, because like Girl Gone Mad, it was a little bit more thriller-esque, and we wanted to make it more suspense. And so the way she'd explained it was suspense was more of that, the violence happening off the page, the more of that dread, like you had mentioned, as opposed to thrillers where we're seeing a lot of more of that, the violence on the page. And so I know we didn't really get into this, but that was another thing, really playing with just readers, not only their expectations, but just their imagination. So oftentimes having things happen off the page is going to be more chilling in most cases, or going to leave more of a lingering effect than having it actually on the page. And actually, I don't know if the book is readily available. Do I have it here? Yes, I do. One of the authors that I'm a big fan of, who actually kind of mentored me in a way, is Stuart Annan. And this was his novel, The Good Wife, about a woman whose husband goes to prison. And she basically is, I feel like she has a baby or something like that. And it's basically just her whole struggle with him in prison. And one of the first sections, she's home alone. Um, she's home alone, and let's see here, let me just read it. She's home alone at night. I think it's the middle of the night. When the phone goes off, it's like a memory, the ring calling her back to the present. Immediately she knows it's about him, someone from the jail. It's past midnight, the time reserved for bad news. She slaps at the phone, grips it. A man asks if this is Mrs. Dickerson, older, serious, official. Yes, she says. This is she. Mrs. Dickerson, he says calmly. Do you know how easy it would be to kill you right now? And that's how the chapter ends. There's no, we don't see like her reaction to the call. We don't see, how she feels. And I feel like, and this is something that I know that Stuart Annan had mentioned before, it was kind of that stepping back as the author, not showing that reaction. The reader instead feels that reaction in their place. And that's something I've always tried to keep in mind too, especially, and it's really a more literary sensibility, but it's, even for the thrillers, kind of, keeping that in mind.
Yeah, because your head fills in the details with, what if this was someone I knew? What if this was my wife? What if this was my kid? That unknown is much more terrifying. I know when someone gets murdered, I want closure. We want to find the body, because then you have the story. You don't have all the what ifs.
Exactly. And in fact, do I even have a copy here? Like, even with the serial killer's wife, I think I even did that. The very first chapter of the serial killer's wife, it ends with her getting that call, and he says, how do you want me to kill your son, slow or fast, or something like that? And like, it just ends that way on that question, and we don't see her reaction.
Yeah. I did have one question for you. I go to a lot of movies, a ton of movies, way more movies than I should. But I end up seeing a bunch of crap. I watched this most recent Liam Neeson thriller where he's stuck in his car and he can't get out because there's a bomb under his seat. It'll blow him up. And I thought, these thrillers that we watch nowadays are terrible. There's no logical consistency. The writing's bad. Have you had interest from Hollywood? Your stores would make good movies. They might get ruined by Hollywood too. I don't know.
So. Yes, I appreciate that. I've never had anything optioned before. There's been a few emails that would come in every once in a while expressing interest, but nothing ever really came of it. I'm certainly would always be open to having something done, but there is always that concern where either things will end up in development hell, which is that thing where, a studio buys the rights to it and then decades pass, nothing ever happens to it. Some writers get really lucky. Dennis Lehane is one that comes to mind. I mean, he's had Clint Eastwood direct one of his movies. He's had Martin Scorsese direct one of his movies. He's had other things done, but sometimes it's just writing the right people at the right time, the right studio. And again, even if something is made, there's no guarantee it's going to be a good movie. One thriller writer that comes to mind, he had a movie come out recently. You might not even know it came out. I mean, it was more or less direct to video. It didn't get great reviews, and that's always a concern as well. I will say though, Hollywood just, sometimes it's just, they like the, formulaic stuff. It seems like they're like the paint by numbers. Sometimes it really comes down to just, so an author friend of mine, he had this movie ready to go. They had a script in place, they had a director in place, everything was ready to go. And then right before they were ready to start, one of the actors dropped out, and then the whole thing fell apart. So, that stuff happens too. So, I mean, the film agent right now, they are, shopping around the Killing Room. We'll see what happens. I'm not getting my hopes up, because that's one of those things when it comes to like, TV and film, it's hard enough to get something options, let alone something ever get made is, very, very hard to have happen. And then, of course, having something get made that's really good is another struggle. So it'd be nice to have something happen one of these days, but I'm not holding my breath.
To be a cameo, to be honest with you. I'll just like walk by in the background and, just put in my place for the cameo right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll see what we can do. We'll see what
All
we
right,
can
cool.
do.
I appreciate
Well, thank
that
you
you being
again.
here.
No, thank you again, Dustin.
Oh,
I appreciate it.
I wanted to say this one last thing. I love how your emails that I get don't feel like they come from a publishing company, someone who doesn't really know you writing on behalf of you. We get the picture of the dog at the end of the email, and they feel very personal. I assume you write them yourself. I don't know, but I want to say that too. That's a nice little touch. So, I'm done.
Yes, the newsletters are. I try to do those. I try to keep them interesting. I don't. Some people do like weekly Substacks, and I thought about maybe doing something this weekly, and I was like, nah, just at least once a month, to like check in, some news here and there. I don't want to like clog people's inboxes, but I appreciate that too. Thank you for being a subscriber and a reader, and for taking the time to check in tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Robert, for joining us this evening. It's been great.
Thank you again for having me and all the great questions, and good luck with your writing.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, Betsy did ask, how does she get on the newsletter? Is it through your website?
Yes, on my newsletter, there's on my website there is a tab to sign up for the newsletter. And all subscribers should get a free exclusive ebook. I wrote for the Holly Lynn series. I wrote, and again, it was one of those things trying to add on special stuff. There's a Holly Lynn story that I wrote specifically for newsletter subscribers, so you can't get it anywhere else. So if you sign up, you should get a welcome email that has a link to get that story. But yeah, on my website.
And you get other bonuses. I got a little prequel novella for The Killing Room for pre-ordering it. That I found through that newsletter too. So
yeah, you know what, Dustin, real quick, because I haven't really heard from many people. How was that story?
No, that was great.
It a good prequel?
Okay, it was fine. It was too short.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things I just wanted to do. And again, you did not read that first, right? Because even though it was a prequel story, I made it very clear because you were going to ruin it.
You warned very clearly in the novella that do not read this. Hey, I'm serious. Do not read this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I read the book first and then went back and read. Yeah, it was great. It was, short and punchy and done. Yeah. No complaints.
And again, that's one of those things too. That's not really going to be available. At least there's no plans right now anywhere else. So that was mostly just for people who had pre-ordered it. And I'm doing some more live events. So if anybody happens to see this before any future live events, I have a few extra chapbooks left. But yeah, that was something just as trying to get people to pre-order, because oftentimes, honestly, as a writer, it's very hard to get people to pre-order. Even as an author, I sometimes know, I try to be more conscious of pre-ordering authors, books, because I know how important that is. So again, Dustin, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So everyone, that's his website, robertswartwood.com. And yeah, right on the front there, you can definitely sign up in the upper right-hand corner newsletter. So definitely check it out. So, and then again, this recording will be on our YouTube channel. So anybody who wasn't able to make it this evening, you can definitely still check it out. So thank you so much again, Robert, for joining us this evening, and best of luck on the rest of your book tour.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you.